Welcome to Allies or Enemies. I'm Jess.
And I am Sean. And today we are talking about Ironwood. And our copy was provided for review, but the thoughts are all our own.
Ironwood is designed by Maël, Brunet, and Julien Chaput, and it is a two-player asymmetric game. One group are the Ironclad, and they're trying to build these giant iron forges. And the other group are the Woodwalkers, and they're trying to take back their totems back to their forests. But before we get too into it, let's look at how it plays.
At the start of the game, you choose either the Ironclad or the Woodwalkers, and you take the corresponding player board and cards. You start with your 3 base cards and a bunch of fighters either near the central city of Farum or in the outer forests. Each round starts by gaining crystals and drawing cards, and then, starting with the Woodwalkers, you take turns playing those cards. Cards will give you all sorts of actions, such as moving fighters, attacking, and doing things to help your side's unique win condition. If you're the Ironclad, this will mean building cities in the outer regions and then turning those cities into forges, which is largely done by collecting up crystals, by moving your giant drill about, and protecting your lands from Woodwalker attacks. If you're the Woodwalkers, you will be trying to find and secure your totems by locating them with vision cards and then clearing out the Ironclad so you can snatch that totem and take it back to the safety of your forest. After 3 cards each, the round is over, and players take back their starter cards, discard the others, pay crystals for new troops, and do it all over again. There is a lot more nuance to it than that, but the game ends once one side either builds 3 forges or secures 3 totems, and then the land is at peace once more.
Each of the factions plays incredibly differently, and it seems like pretty simple what you need to do. On the surface of it, you just have to build your 3 forges or get your 3 totems. However, the other group is always getting in your way and causing you a lot of frustration.
Yeah, there's on paper, you should be able to do everything in 10 turns. It's like, well, this isn't going to take very long. I'm going to get these things right away. And you do generally get kind of your first one pretty quick because the other group doesn't have an army out. They don't have a hand of cards built up that much. But boy, getting out the third one, either building that 3rd forge or taking back that 3rd totem, gets so hard because the other person at that point knows oh, they want to build it here or here, or the totem is going to be in this spot, or they've built up those cards that are going to be the most frustrating stopping you cards. And I think that's really where the fun of the game is too.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's not really an area control game because you can never be in the exact same area at once. You're both just trying to accomplish your very specific goals. And so you are constantly balancing, trying to get done what you want to get done with trying to stop your opponent. Because you do have to invest in stopping your opponent.
Yeah, it is kind of an area control game, especially for the Ironclad. But you're right, you can't be in the same place, which is interesting. I don't know of another game that does. I'm sure that there's other games out there, but because the Ironclad can only be in those city areas and the Woodwalkers can only be in the forest areas, you're never in the same place, so you're always attacking kind of from afar, which is really cool, but still you want to be able to have your people there and not be getting attacked. You need to clear people out. And that's the cool thing with the battles too, because the battles are deterministic. There's no die rolling, there's no anything else, but the thing you don't know is what cards the other person playing. And often you don't really need to necessarily win and get rid of their troops. You just need to stay in it so that you've got more flags and you can push them out of there. And then you can have a little bit of breathing room in your space to do whatever it is you want. And that is a big part of the game.
Yeah, I do like the battles and how there isn't any dice rolling, but it is very difficult because your strong cards that you can play as your attack cards are often strong cards that you might want to keep as like actions for the future. And so it's really difficult to decide, do I want to give this up to make sure I can win or not? And like you said, like you don't necessarily need to deal the most damage. It is about those flags at the end, but losing troops for either side is really difficult because that's going to make both of your goals more challenging, and you usually never want to leave. So if somebody wins and ties go to the attacker, then they get to move the defenders to a different area. And for either faction, that's usually going to be bad news.
Yeah, it is. And it's so much kind of resource management, because it is kind of the resource management with those cards, with playing that attack or defense card and then losing that card. But also, like for the Ironclad, it's all about the crystals. It's all about holding onto your crystals, because you need 5 crystals to build a forge, and that's a lot of crystals in this game. You can build those up. You move this awesome little drill thing around that collects stuff up, and then you drop it off at forges, and that's actually really fun to do too. But you need those crystals to build that city or to build that forge, but you also need them for a lot of your cards. You need them to build more troops. You need them for a lot of the cards let you play more things if you use crystals. So often I find myself being like, well, I think I can build a forge, but I need to stop her, so I need to spend this crystal on this, and then, well, I've already spent some crystals, so I may as well spend more crystals. And so that economy is really interesting.
Yeah, and it is interesting because it is asymmetric factions, but the general gameplay is the same, because you take turns playing cards, and that will determine your actions, and your actions are mainly going to be moving and attacking primarily, with a few other little things. But like you said, for the Ironclad, crystals is a really big thing, whereas I found for the Woodwalkers, there's a lot of like burning your cards, so much so that you often get like a bonus for some cards. If you use those cards to burn, you get a little like a crystal or some kind of advantage. So there are like even more differences in the resources you're managing a little bit between the two.
Yeah, when I was the Ironclad, I found have more of a thing where you're putting these cubes on cards, and then you're getting rid of those cubes at the beginning of rounds, but you're getting to do an action based on that card again. And so they're a lot more kind of building that engine up and then slowly getting rid of those things. And I think in a lot of ways too, and a lot of people compare this to Star Wars Rebellion, and I do get this, it's a very, very different game. But what feels kind of similar is that the Ironclad is all about building up that big army, and they're generally more powerful, they have more powerful units, they have more ways to get extra attacks, whereas the Woodwalkers are kind of the rebellion, like sneaking in and out, and they've got to be kind of dispersed about and like a little bit more agile.
Yeah, and the Ironclad, you definitely have to build up as well. And I think those cards where you put the cube on it and then eventually activate later play into that strategy of building towards a long-term investment. And so what we found, and we looked this up online, and we're not the only ones, is that people tend to win as the Woodwalkers for their first few games because they're easier to play off of the bat. The Ironclad, you can win. It just requires more long-term thinking, more understanding the strategy, more holding on to the right cards for the right time. And so finally, we've managed to have an Ironclad win. It went to you, which is unfortunate, but it can happen.
Yeah, and I think once you kind of cross that hurdle, I think from here on out, it's going to be kind of 50-50, because it felt so tight that game. And even the game before, I think you started to kind of pick up how the Ironclad worked kind of halfway through.
Yeah, a bit too late.
Yeah, as well, but you kind of see that, and then you're like, oh, okay, these are the cards that I need to stop them. I need to kind of disperse, but I need to build up. I don't want to fight right away. There's just more to think about, and so it is those first few games you're going to feel like, oh, these Woodwalkers, they're unstoppable. They're so strong. But once you kind of cross that hurdle, and I think this is a good game to play with the same 2 people a lot too, because then you're going to build up that knowledge together. And then it's like, oh, I get it. And then you're reading each other, and it just becomes a much more interesting game. But it does take like 3 games.
Yeah, and in the rule book, they do have some suggestions for if you are experienced and you're playing against a new person, how to even the playing field a bit, which is great. But it is really nice if you have a consistent player, because like you said, you're both progressing at the same rate. So in terms of player count, this is 1 to 2 players. We have only played it at 2 players, but there does seem to be an extensive solo mode.
Yeah, so I haven't used the bot, but I've really looked into the bot and looked at, so there's two different bots. There's one for the Woodwalkers, one for the Ironclad, and there's like quite a bit going on with those bots. Like the rest of the game, the rules are quite clear, and it first feels like, oh, there's a lot here, but this is really a game that you need that rule book for that first play, and then you pretty much barely look at it again, because once you've internalized all of those systems, it kind of makes a lot of sense what you're doing. And I feel like that is going to be a lot similar for the bots as well. But the cool thing with the bots is that there are 15 levels for both of the bots too. So there is a lot of movement. Like there's a lot of room to grow and to fight against those. And just knowing Mindclash games and their solo modes generally are quite strong, that I feel like I'm really excited to play against those and to play against both of those too.
So like you said, the rule book we found was pretty clear. It is a lot to take in at first, but then after that, it was quite straightforward. But in terms of like the rest of the production, it looks really, really good. I love the trays. So they each come with their own tray that makes it really easy to set up. The components are amazing and play into the theme, where the Woodwalkers have wooden components and the Ironclad have like metallic components, and those look great.
Oh yeah, the Ironclad, they're like heavy too.
Yeah.
Like they got a lot of weight to all of their different things, and they've got different sized units as well. So they've got their little guys, and then they got these larger called golems. But then also the drills, really cool. The things that you're flipping over, the cities and forges, are really cool. So yeah, the production's tremendous. And the card, like all the card art's really nice. The cards are nice and clear. We were lucky, and so we got these shiny cards at Essen as well, which actually make quite a difference if you can track down the shiny cards, because then your starter cards are really obvious all the time. The tricky is their names are wrong. Like their names are different. So the names in the rule book, when it's like, oh, use this card, and we're like, oh no, where's that card? It's just, there's fancier different names for it. But yeah, I just have no complaints about the components. Like,
yeah, I really like the map. I think the map looks great, and I think the card symbols you get a handle on after your first game.
Oh yeah, those are a little bit
hard. You have
hard.
to be like, oh, is this a built forge? Is it an unbuilt forge? What kind of worker? But again, you pick that up quite quickly. And I do really like that there are the starter cards. So the main actions that you need to do will always be in your hand at the start of each round, which is great because then it feels less luck dependent on what cards you're grabbing. Because if you happen to have like a hand where you can't move, that could be unfortunate, but you will always have those starter cards.
Yeah, I will say though, the card icons when you are the Woodwalkers are a little tricky to tell apart when it's a starter card, when it's a card with a cube, when it's a regular special card, I think they're called. Those are a little bit hard. I guess you do get a handle on it pretty quick, but still, if you have trouble seeing, you may need to, be able to magnify those a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, and I think that's the only thing. Other than that, it all looks great.
And it's a nice slim box too, and I love a slim box.
In terms of replayability, it's really that there are these two factions and you're competing against each other. So you're never going to be doing the same thing because you always have to be reactive to what your opponent does. And there's quite a big difference in what the cards that you add to your hand can do that I think will significantly affect your strategy each game as well. Yeah,
there's kind of an emergent story, like a bit of a narrative that comes into this game as well, and I always really appreciate that in games. And it is definitely going to play different because the Woodwalkers have different cards for where their totems are hidden, and that makes a huge difference. Like if you pull a bunch that are in those middle sections, you got to play a lot different than if you get lucky and pull the ones in the outside sections. You always start with one in the middle.
Yeah.
And then you kind of draw from the outside after that. But it's going to be a little bit the same too with building those forges. Like if you end up that I'm trying to build a forge where you're trying to steal a totem, then that really becomes somewhere. Like our last game, we had these huge armies fighting over this one space forever. And other games we've had where someone's trying to build stuff up top and someone else is trying to steal stuff down on the bottom, and everything's kind of ones and twos all around the map, where it's all these little skirmishes.
And so that is going to play quite a bit different. But those cards too, because they're so powerful, they do such big things. There are these like little moments where it's like, oh, I've done this huge thing and now these guys can't move at all and you've got this giant army and they're pinned here because I played this card, or you've done whatever it is. And those like big moments feel like those big cinematic moments.
So in terms of who we think this is for, who do you think the target audience is?
So I think this has quite a specific audience, but I do think that they are going to appreciate what this is. But I think, first of all, this is going to be for people who are only going to play with 1 or 2 people because that's all that it can play with. So if you generally have a group that is going to play with 4 or 5 and likes these big, massive games, this obviously isn't going to be a fit because this is strictly 1 or 2. It is also nice if you have someone you're going to play this against a lot so that you can have, you know, an even level opponent because you will be building up at the same time. I think that is important for this too. And it's going to be for people who are okay with getting frustrated because a huge part of this game is that frustration of like, oh, I'm 1 turn away from doing this and they won't let me do it because they're trying to do the thing. And then they're like, I'm 1 thing away and they won't let me do it. And so there is a lot of that. There's a lot of like, I just need that one other thing. So you've got to be okay with that, and okay with, even though the combat doesn't have die rolling, it's not particularly aggressive combat, it still is losing stuff, and it still is, you know, another layer of that frustration. But if you like that, like, it's a fun frustration, it's a puzzly frustration. So if you're okay with that, if you like that sort of thing, this does it really well.
Yeah, and there is definitely interaction because of that, because of all the conflict involved. So it's a highly interactive game, but it's also a very thinky game. So it's not like you can just kind of turn your brain off, move your troops, and battle. You really have to plan ahead. So you might end up with a little AP as you figure out your next move, which might lead to your next move, and which cards to hold on to for attack. So if you really like thinky, interactive conflict games, this fits in that like exact genre.
And that is it. That is Ironwood. Have you played Ironwood? What did you think? And also, what are other 2-player specific-y games like this? We've always heard Raptor and Skulk Hollow, which I've always wanted to play, but are there others? What do you think of those?
Thank you so much for watching. As usual, please like, subscribe, and hopefully we'll see you next time for another game.